The helicopter was already on the pad when the reporters arrived. Its rotors were still. 2 Swiss guards stood beside it in full ceremonial dress, which was unusual because Swiss guards do not normally accompany the Pope to Castel Gandolfo, not for routine visits, not on a Tuesday, and not when the Vatican press office has explicitly told every accredited journalist that the Pope's schedule for the day includes nothing of public interest. But there they were, standing perfectly straight in the morning light, halberds at their sides, watching the small group of journalists approach the rope line as if they had been expecting them. And when a Vatican correspondent for an Italian wire service asked a press officer why the guards were there, the answer she received was a single word. Precaution, she pressed. Precaution against what? The press officer looked at her for a moment. Then he walked away without answering. Nobody believed the original explanation for a second, because 40 minutes earlier, something had happened inside the Apostolic Palace that had not been on any schedule, any briefing, or any internal communication that any journalist or curial official had access to. Pope Leo XIV had walked out of a meeting with the Secretariat of State 17 minutes before it was scheduled to end. He had returned to his private apartments at a pace that his security detail described as urgent without running. He had spoken briefly with his personal secretary, Monsignor Andres, and then he had given an order that no one on his staff had heard him give before. Prepare the helicopter, now, not for Castel Gandolfo, from Castel Gandolfo. The Pope was not going to the papal residence outside Rome. He was leaving it. He had been there since the previous evening, one of his regular Tuesday retreats to the Villa Barberini, the 17th-century residence nestled in the Barberini Gardens that he had been using while the main apostolic palace of Castel Gandolfo underwent renovations planned for the summer. He usually stayed until late afternoon. Sometimes he walked the gardens. Sometimes he read in the library overlooking Lake Albano. Sometimes he simply sat in the small stone chapel and did nothing at all. But today he was leaving hours early, and the reason, according to a Monsignor who overheard the phone call that triggered the sudden departure, was a single document that had been delivered to the villa by diplomatic courier at 6:40 that morning. A document the Pope read twice before picking up the phone and calling Rome. A document that, when his secretary asked what it contained, made the Pope say something his staff had never heard him say before in a year of service. We are out of time. 3 words, spoken quietly, without emphasis, the way a surgeon speaks when the scan shows something that changes the operation. If you want to know what was in that document, and what the Pope said to the reporters waiting on the landing pad that sent shockwaves through every major newsroom in Europe, Latin America, and the United States, stay with this video. Do not skip a single minute. Subscribe and turn on notifications right now, because what happened at Castel Gandolfo that morning is the beginning of something the Vatican has lost the ability to control. The papal residence at Castel Gandolfo sits on the rim of a volcanic crater lake about 30 kilometers southeast of Rome. The town is small, fewer than 9,000 people, but the palace that overlooks it is enormous. Built by Carlo Maderno in the 17th century for Pope Urban VIII, it has served as the summer retreat of the papacy since 1626. For 4 centuries, popes have escaped Rome's brutal heat to this hilltop, where the air is cooler, the gardens stretch over 55 hectares, and the distance from the Roman Curia provides something that no office in the Vatican can: silence. Pope Francis broke the tradition. In his 12-year pontificate, he never once used the residence as a retreat. He turned sections of it into a museum. He opened the gardens to tourists. He made a point of staying in Rome, in the Domus Sanctae Martae, signaling that the papacy did not need a second palace. But when Robert Francis Prevost became Pope Leo XIV on May 8, 2025, one of his first quiet decisions was to restore Castel Gandolfo to its original function. He began visiting on Tuesdays, short trips at first, a few hours of solitary prayer and reading, then longer stays. His brother told a reporter that the Pope intended to make Castel Gandolfo his second home, even more than his predecessors had. Starting July 6th, a full 2-week sojourn was planned. Leo XIV found something in Castel Gandolfo that the Vatican could not offer him. Not luxury. The Villa Barberini was modest by papal standards. Not beauty, though the views over the crater lake were extraordinary. What he found was the ability to think without interruption, to sit with a problem long enough to see all its edges, to make decisions in a silence that was actual silence, not the performative quiet of an institution that was always, at every level, watching. But on this particular Tuesday morning, that silence was shattered before dawn. The diplomatic courier arrived at the gates of the Villa Barberini at 6:37. He was not from the Secretariat of State. He was from the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith, the department responsible for doctrine, discipline, and the enforcement of canonical law. He carried a sealed diplomatic pouch of the kind used for documents classified at the highest level of Vatican internal security. The pouch bore 2 stamps, 2 seals, and required 2 signatures to open, the Pope's and his secretary's. The courier was escorted to the entrance hall by a member of the Gendarmerie Corps. He waited there for 11 minutes. Then Monsignor Andres came down the stairs, signed the receipt, and took the pouch upstairs. The courier would later tell a colleague that when Andres came back down to confirm receipt and dismiss him, the Monsignor's face was a color he had never seen on a living person. He said, he looked like a man who had just been told the building was on fire but was not allowed to run. What was in that pouch has not been officially disclosed. The Vatican press office has declined to acknowledge the courier's visit. The Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith has referred all inquiries to the Secretariat of State. The Secretariat of State has said nothing at all, but from 3 independent sources, one inside the Dicastery, one inside the papal household, and one diplomat who was briefed by phone within hours, the following picture has been assembled. The document was an intelligence summary, not military intelligence, not the kind of report a government produces. Ecclesiastical intelligence, the product of the Vatican's diplomatic network, the oldest and most extensive in the world, operating through nuncios, apostolic delegates, and church officials in every country on earth. The kind of report that is produced when something is happening that the Pope must know about immediately. This particular summary concerned the Society of St. Pius X, not the July 1st consecrations. Those were already known, already addressed by the formal warning Cardinal Fernandez had issued on May 13th. Not the declaration of Catholic faith that the SSPX's Superior General, Father Davide Pagliarani, had published on May 14th in response to that warning. Those were public matters. They were being handled through public channels. This was something different, something that had happened in the previous 48 hours and that had not appeared in any public communication, any press statement, or any document accessible to journalists. The SSPX had made contact with 3 diocesan bishops, 3 sitting bishops in 3 different countries, bishops who led established dioceses with hundreds of thousands of Catholic faithful, bishops appointed by previous popes, men with unquestioned canonical standing, full communion with Rome, and no prior public association with the traditionalist movement. The contact was not accidental. It was not casual. It was coordinated. 3 separate approaches, 3 different intermediaries, all within the same 12-hour window. And the message, according to the intelligence summary, was essentially identical in each case. The SSPX was offering them a deal. If those 3 bishops agreed to participate in the July 1st consecrations as co-consecrators, standing alongside the SSPX bishop and lending their legitimate canonical authority to the ceremony, the entire framework of the Vatican's response would collapse, because the consecrations would no longer be an act of a breakaway group defying the Pope. They would be an act endorsed by bishops within the Church's own structure, bishops with parishes, bishops with faithful, bishops whose excommunication would create vacancies, legal chaos, and pastoral catastrophe in 3 separate countries simultaneously. The SSPX was not just defying the Vatican. It was trying to make the Vatican's own bishops complicit in the defiance. It was trying to turn the Church's own hierarchy into a shield against the Church's own discipline. One Vatican diplomat who read the summary described it in terms that have since circulated through every level of the Curia. He called it the most sophisticated canonical trap anyone has set for a pope in half a century. Pope Leo XIV read the document twice, slowly, carefully, sitting in the small study on the 2nd floor of the Villa Barberini, where he usually began his mornings with prayer and correspondence. The study has a single window overlooking the lake. The shutters were still closed when the document arrived. By the time he finished reading it the 2nd time, the shutters were open, and the morning light was flooding the room. Then he picked up the phone and called Cardinal Victor Manuel Fernandez directly. The call lasted 9 minutes. Neither man has disclosed what was said, but within half an hour, 3 decisions had been made. The helicopter was ordered prepared for immediate departure from Castel Gandolfo. The Pope's entire afternoon schedule in Rome was cleared, and a meeting was convened at the Apostolic Palace for 11 o'clock, a meeting that had not existed on any calendar 60 minutes earlier, attended by people who had not expected to be in the same room that day. The Pope was airborne by 9:15. He landed at the Vatican helipad at 9:48, and what he found when the helicopter doors opened surprised every member of his security detail. Reporters, 7 of them. A small pool of Vatican correspondents, 3 Italian, 1 French, 1 American, 1 Spanish, 1 German, who had been tipped off not by any official channel, but by the simple reality that helicopter movements over Rome are visible, and when a papal helicopter lifts off from Castel Gandolfo 3 hours ahead of schedule, experienced Vatican watchers notice. They were standing behind a rope line near the helipad entrance. Their expectations were low. A papal arrival is almost always silent. The Pope steps out, enters a waiting car, and vanishes into the Apostolic Palace. No statements, no questions, no interaction. Protocol does not allow it. Custom does not encourage it. The Pope does not stop. But Pope Leo XIV stopped. He walked toward the rope line. Not quickly, not with the energy of a man making a calculated gesture for the cameras. He walked slowly, deliberately, with the same measured stride that people who had known him in Peru described as the pace of a man who had learned to move through the world without startling anyone. He stopped 3 meters from the reporters, and he spoke. "I know you are here because the helicopter came early," he said in Italian. His voice was low, almost conversational, with the slight American inflection that even a year in the Vatican had not erased. "I want to tell you something before the press office tells you something different." 7 reporters scrambled for their phones, their recorders, their notebooks. One of them, the French correspondent, later told a colleague that her hands were shaking so badly she nearly dropped her device. Another, the American, said he forgot his own recording app for 3 seconds and just stared. Nobody had prepared for this. Nobody had expected this. Nobody had a single question written down. The Pope continued, "I have received information this morning that changes my understanding of the situation facing this church. I am not going to tell you what that information is. Not yet. Not today. But I want you to hear this directly from me. Because in the coming days, there will be people inside this institution who will try to present what I'm about to do as an overreaction, as panic, as a man losing control of a situation that was already beyond his ability to manage." He paused. He looked at each of the 7 faces in turn. The way, one reporter noted, a teacher looks at a class before saying, "the thing that matters." It is none of those things. He took 1 step closer to the rope line. "What I'm about to do, the decision I will make, is the most difficult choice I have faced since I accepted the responsibility of this office. And I am making it because I believe, with everything I have learned in my life as a priest, as a missionary, as a bishop, and now as the Bishop of Rome, that the survival of this church depends on it." A reporter asked the only question anyone in that group could think to ask. "Holy Father, what decision?" Pope Leo XIV looked at her for a long moment. The silence stretched for what one observer estimated was 5 full seconds, long enough to feel like a conversation happening without words. Then he spoke. "You will know within the week," he said. "And when you do, I ask you to remember this moment. I am telling you now, standing here, looking at you, without notes, without a statement, without the filter of a press office. This is not politics. This is not strategy. This is not institutional maneuvering." His voice dropped slightly. "This is a man who loves this church, trying to save it from people who would rather see it break than let it grow." Then he turned, walked to the waiting car, and was driven into the Apostolic Palace. The door closed. The car disappeared behind the walls. The 7 reporters stood in silence for approximately 4 seconds. Then every phone in the group began dialing simultaneously. Within 1 hour, the Pope's statement was on every wire service in Italy. Within 2 hours, it was being translated into 30 languages and republished by outlets on 6 continents. Within 3 hours, every Vatican correspondent in the world, including those who had not been at the helipad, was calling the press office demanding clarification, context, background, anything. The press office provided none. They did not deny the statement. They did not confirm it. They did not provide context, interpretation, or spin. They issued a single line, released through the normal channels at 1:45 that afternoon. The Holy Father returned from Castel Gandolfo this morning and is attending to scheduled matters of governance. That non-statement was, in itself, extraordinary. Under normal circumstances, the Vatican press office would have immediately characterized the Pope's words, softened the edges, added qualifiers. They would have explained that the Pope was speaking pastorally, not operationally. They would have insisted that no specific decision had been made. The fact that they said nothing meant one of two things. Either they had been explicitly instructed to remain silent, or they themselves did not yet know what was happening. Both possibilities created the same effect inside the Curia. Alarm. The 11 o'clock meeting convened in the Sala Bologna, a room on the second floor of the Apostolic Palace typically used for mid-level diplomatic briefings. But the men seated around the table that morning were not mid-level officials. Cardinal Fernandez was there, seated to the Pope's right. The Secretary of State, Cardinal Pietro Parolin, was there, his face composed into the diplomatic neutrality that had defined his entire career. The prefect of the dicastery for bishops was present. The Pope's personal theologian sat at the far end, and two canon lawyers, specialists in the law of schism, both summoned from their offices with less than 90 minutes' notice, sat across from each other with legal texts already open. The meeting lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. No minutes were taken. No staff were allowed in the room. No electronic devices were permitted. The Pope himself had instructed that the session be conducted without any written record, a demand so unusual that one of the canon lawyers later confided to a colleague that he had to ask twice to confirm he had heard correctly. "In 30 years of service to the Holy See," he said, "I have never been asked to attend a meeting where no record was to be kept. That alone told me the severity of what we were discussing." What emerged from that room has been assembled from fragments: overheard conversations in the corridors afterward, phone calls made by participants in the hours that followed, and the observable actions that the Vatican took in the days ahead. The first action was immediate and surgical. Within 1 hour of the meeting's conclusion, the Apostolic Nuncio in each of the 3 countries where the SSPX had made contact with diocesan bishops received a direct personal instruction from the Secretariat of State. The instruction was identical in all 3 cases: meet with the bishop in question, face to face, before the end of the week, no intermediaries, no letters, in person. Deliver 1 question from the Pope: do you wish to remain in communion with the Bishop of Rome? The precision of that question was deliberate and devastating. It did not ask the bishops to condemn the SSPX. It did not ask them to swear loyalty. It did not offer explanations or make threats. It simply posed the foundational question of Catholic ecclesiology, the question that, under the Church's own theology, admits only 2 possible answers: yes or no, in or out. There is no middle. The second action was procedural. The 2 canon lawyers were given a 72-hour deadline to prepare a legal framework for the immediate suspension of any diocesan bishop who participated in an unauthorized episcopal consecration, not excommunication. That would come later, through the established canonical process. Suspension, a faster, quieter instrument, one that could remove a bishop from his authority before the media, the faithful, or the bishop himself fully understood what had happened. The canon lawyers began working that afternoon. They did not leave the building until 4 in the morning. By dawn, they had produced a preliminary framework, 14 pages of canonical argumentation, precedent analysis, and procedural mechanisms that, if invoked, would allow the Pope to remove a sitting bishop from his authority within 72 hours of a verified schismatic act. The document drew on precedents dating back to the Council of Trent. It referenced the 1983 Code of Canon Law, the 1998 Apostolic Letter Ad Tuendam Fidem, and a rarely invoked provision of the Apostolic Constitution Pastor Bonus that grants the Pope emergency disciplinary authority in cases of imminent schism. The provision had been used exactly twice in modern history, once by Pius X in 1951, once by John Paul II in 1997, both times in secret, both times effectively. The canon lawyers titled their document Protocol for Extraordinary Episcopal Suspension. They delivered it to the Pope's secretary at 7:15 the next morning. By 8 o'clock, it was on the Pope's desk. By 9, he had read it, annotated 4 pages in the margins, and returned it with a single instruction written at the top in his careful handwriting. Finalize. Do not circulate. The machine was being built, quietly, precisely, and with a speed that told everyone involved that the Pope did not expect to have the luxury of deliberation. The third action was the one that surprised everyone in the room. Pope Leo XIV instructed the Secretariat of State to begin preparing a formal papal address, not a homily during Mass, not a written message read by someone else, a live address delivered by the Pope himself from the Apostolic Palace, broadcast to the world, in which he would speak directly to the faithful about the threat facing the Church. He wanted to name the threat, not in the abstract, not in theological generalities. He wanted to describe, in plain and specific language, exactly what the SSPX had done: the coordinated outreach to diocesan bishops, the attempt to weaponize the Church's own canonical structure, the strategy designed to make excommunication politically impossible. Cardinal Parolin, the Secretary of State, raised an objection. A public address describing the SSPX's internal strategy would harden their position irreversibly. It would eliminate any possibility of future reconciliation. It would be seen not as pastoral leadership, but as political warfare conducted from the chair of Peter. The Pope listened carefully. Then he said, "Pietro, reconciliation requires 2 parties who wish to be reconciled. What we are facing is not a disagreement. It is an infiltration. And you do not negotiate with an infiltration, you expose it." Fernandez spoke next. He said, measured as always, "Holy Father, if you deliver this address, you will be accused of declaring war on tradition itself, not just the SSPX, every Catholic who loves the Latin Mass, every Catholic who has concerns about the direction of the Church. They will hear your words as an attack on them personally." The Pope nodded. "I know," he said. "That is why the language must be exact. It must draw a line, visibly, unmistakably, permanently, between Catholics who love tradition and those who are using tradition as a weapon to break this Church. If I cannot communicate that distinction in a way that ordinary people understand, then I deserve the criticism. But I will not earn their understanding by remaining silent while someone dismantles the structure from inside." He looked around the table. Silence is not neutrality, not anymore. In this moment, silence is complicity, and I refuse to be complicit. In the days since, the preparations have intensified. A speechwriter from the Secretariat of State has been assigned to draft the address. The Pope has requested input from 2 theologians, one European, one Latin American, to ensure the language works across cultures. The Vatican's technical team has begun preparing broadcast infrastructure for a live transmission. The 3 nuncios conducted their meetings. 2 of the 3 bishops gave their answers within 48 hours. Both said yes, they wished to remain in communion with Rome. Both said they had declined the SSPX's approach. One of them reportedly told the nuncio, "I was tempted. I will not pretend otherwise. But I am not willing to burn down the house I was ordained to serve." The 3rd bishop has not yet answered. His meeting with the nuncio took place on a Saturday afternoon, in the bishop's private residence, with no staff present. The nuncio, a veteran diplomat who had served in 4 countries and negotiated with governments, rebels, and warlords, later told a colleague that it was the most difficult conversation of his career. Not because the bishop was hostile, not because he was defiant, because he was honest. The bishop told the nuncio that he had been approached by the SSPX through an intermediary he had known for 15 years, a monsignor who had served in his diocese before joining a traditionalist community. The intermediary had been respectful, careful, and deeply persuasive. He had not asked the bishop to rebel. He had not asked him to reject the Pope. He had asked him to consider whether the Church was better served by a Pope who demanded obedience or by bishops who demanded truth. The bishop said, "He made me question things I have not questioned in 30 years of priesthood, and I am not sure, sitting here now, that I have answers." The nuncio asked the question he had been sent to ask. "Do you wish to remain in communion with the Bishop of Rome?" The bishop looked at him for a long time. Then he said, "I need more time." When that response reached Rome, the Pope's reaction was immediate. "Time," he said, "is the one thing none of us has." Meanwhile, the Vatican's intelligence network, operating through apostolic nunciatures, local church officials, and the informal channels that have sustained Vatican diplomacy for centuries, has identified 2 additional contacts between the SSPX and diocesan bishops, 2 more bishops, 2 more countries, 2 more approaches following the same coordinated pattern, the same intermediaries, the same arguments, the same carefully crafted appeal to conscience over obedience. The pattern is expanding. The strategy is not isolated. It is coordinated, systematic, and growing, with a discipline that suggests planning that began long before the public announcement of the July 1st consecrations. This was not an improvisation. This was a campaign. A senior official in the Secretariat of State described the situation to a colleague in terms that have since been repeated at every level of the Vatican's administrative structure. He said, "We thought we were dealing with a group that wanted to consecrate bishops. We were wrong. We are dealing with a group that wants to fracture the episcopate itself, and they are closer to succeeding than anyone in this building wants to admit. The Dicastery for Bishops has begun a quiet audit of every diocesan bishop who has had any contact, formal or informal, with SSPX-affiliated individuals in the past 18 months. The audit is being conducted without the knowledge of the bishops themselves. It is expected to take 2 weeks. The Pope has been briefed daily on its progress. He has asked one question every morning: how many? The number so far has gone up each day. A member of the papal household described Leo XIV's demeanor in the days since Castel Gandolfo in terms that have circulated among the senior staff with a mix of admiration and anxiety. She said, "He sleeps less. He prays more. He writes constantly, in the black notebook, at his desk, sometimes standing at the window overlooking St. Peter's Square at 2 in the morning. I have never seen a man so calm and so urgent at the same time. He is preparing something. I do not know what it is, but I know it will be the moment that defines this pontificate." On that helipad, standing 3 meters from 7 reporters, the Pope had said, "You will know within the week. The week is not over." And the silence that followed the Pope's disappearance into the Apostolic Palace was not the silence of a man retreating. It was not the silence of uncertainty or hesitation. It was the silence of a countdown. Robert Francis Prevost left Castel Gandolfo because a document told him the church he leads is under a threat more calculated and more dangerous than anything the Vatican has faced in decades. He told 7 reporters, standing on concrete in plain language, that he was about to make the hardest decision of his pontificate. And then he walked into the building where popes have made the hardest decisions in the history of Christendom. The door closed behind him. The lights in his study stayed on past midnight, and somewhere in Rome, or perhaps not in Rome, perhaps in a provincial city, in a bishop's residence that smells of old wood and candle wax, in a study lined with theology books and photographs of ordinations, a man who has not yet answered the Pope's question is sitting alone. He is not reading. He is not praying. He is looking at the phone on his desk and trying to decide which number to dial. One number connects him to the nuncio, to Rome, to the Pope, to the institution that ordained him, that gave him his authority, that trusted him with the souls of 300,000 people. The other number connects him to a Monsignor he has known for 15 years, a man who speaks softly, who reasons carefully, who makes questions that should be simple feel impossibly complex. He has been sitting there for over an hour. The phone has not rung, but it will, because the Pope is not a man who waits for answers. He is a man who, when an answer does not come, walks to where the answer lives and asks the question again, standing, face to face, in a voice that does not allow evasion. Robert Francis Prevost learned that in the highlands of Peru, in parishes where the nearest road was a day's walk and the nearest bishop was a week's journey, he learned it in communities where waiting for an answer meant people went without sacraments, without guidance, without hope. He does not wait. He arrives. And when he arrives, the question he carries is always the same. The simplest question in the Catholic faith. The question that every bishop, every priest, every baptized person must eventually face. Where do you stand? If you want to be here when the Pope's decision becomes public, subscribe to this channel now and turn on every notification. What Leo XIV said at that helipad was not a warning. It was a promise. And when the week runs out, this channel will bring you every confirmed detail before anyone else. Stay close. The clock is already running.